Picture this. Clara Voss stood in the marble lobby of Vanguard Precision with her hands resting on an old leather briefcase, when Lydia Crane raised her voice so the whole front desk could hear and said, "You flagged the wrong dates on your first morning. We don't keep people who make trouble for the company. Take that briefcase and get out before I call security." What Lydia didn't know, what nobody on that polished floor knew yet, was that Clara Voss had become the majority owner of the entire operation at midnight, through a trust that had sat quiet for 20 years. By 9 the next morning the chairwoman herself would be reading Clara's name at the head of the table. How does a woman they just sent packing end up the one everybody answers to? Clara had driven in that morning in Elias's old truck, the one with the dented fender and the vinyl seat that cracked a little more every winter. She wasn't looking for trouble. A temp analyst spot had opened up after the regular inspector retired, and she figured her 30 years reading tolerance sheets and supplier reports could help her earn a steady check while the mortgage stayed paid. The briefcase had belonged to Elias, he'd carried it through every plant he ever walked. Inside it, right now, sat her mother's letter, the paper gone soft and yellow at the folds, the last line still clear: "Some men profit from nothing at all, and they'll keep profiting until someone makes them stop." She'd arrived at 7:15, signed the visitor log, and been given a badge that said, "Temp, Analyst." By 8 she was at the first workstation, pulling the latest batch of inspection records the way she always did, quiet, line by line. That's when the dates caught her eye. 3 critical supplier audits had been logged as completed on days the inspectors were documented elsewhere. The metadata showed edits made after the fact. She printed the pages, folded them once, and carried them upstairs. Lydia Crane met her at the railing outside the executive floor. 43 years old, fresh from a consulting firm, already calling herself director of operations. She glanced at the printouts, then at Clara's badge, and raised her voice. Clara didn't argue. She simply asked, "Would you like me to show you where the original stamps are stored?" Lydia's answer was the line about trouble and security. 2 security guards stepped forward. Clara turned, briefcase in hand, and walked back through the lobby doors without another word. She sat in the truck for a minute, the letter still inside the case, then drove 2 blocks to the diner where Elias was already waiting with coffee. He didn't ask what happened. He just slid the cup across the table and said, "You kept 1 copy, didn't you?" At 8:50 the next morning the boardroom door opened and Beatrice Lang looked up from her notes. Every chair turned. Clara walked in wearing the same coat she'd worn the day before, the briefcase at her side. Beatrice cleared her throat. "Mrs. Voss. As of midnight last night, the trust transferred controlling interest. The board welcomes you." Lydia Crane was already seated at the far end. Her face went still. Clara set the briefcase on the table but didn't open it yet. Instead she laid the printed inspection pages in front of the room. "These 3 audits were altered after submission," she said, voice even. "The original files still exist on the server under the old folder path. The timestamps don't match the on-site logs. If anyone would like to see the unaltered versions, I can pull them now." The room stayed silent long enough for the wall clock to tick 3 times. Beatrice Lang was the first to speak. "Show us." Clara set her old leather briefcase on its side and opened the lid just far enough to reach the laptop inside. The board watched her fingers move across the keys, the same steady way she had once checked every weld on the South Dock line. She pulled up the original server path, the one the inspectors had used before anyone started editing. 3 files loaded, each stamped with the real dates and the inspectors' actual signatures. The room stayed quiet except for the soft click of the projector. Beatrice Lang leaned forward, reading the timestamps aloud. Lydia Crane shifted in her chair at the far end of the table, but she kept her voice level when she spoke. "Those could be copies someone planted later," she said. Clara didn't answer her. Instead she opened the letter from the briefcase, the one she had carried for 6 months, and laid it flat beside the printouts. The notary's seal caught the light. Beatrice read the first paragraph, then stopped. "This names Clara Voss as the sole trustee," she said. It was signed the week after Henry passed. The board members began talking over one another, voices low but rising. Lydia stood, claiming she needed to check something on her phone, and stepped into the hallway. Clara remained seated. She folded the letter again, placed it back in the briefcase, and waited. One director asked how long the audits had been wrong. Another wanted to know what the suppliers would say if they learned the records were false. Clara gave them the names and numbers without looking at notes. By the time the meeting broke for lunch, 2 of the auditors had already returned her calls. That was day 1 after the trust passed. The next morning the phone on Clara's desk rang before 7. A parts supplier in Dayton had pulled their shipment because the quality certificate they had received carried yesterday's date, but yesterday's inspector had been on medical leave. The warehouse foreman said the crates looked right from the outside, yet nobody could sign off without the proper paperwork. Clara drove out herself. She parked the truck beside the loading dock, the same spot she had used for 23 years, and walked the line with the shift supervisor. One crate had the wrong heat treatment stamp. 2 others showed weld seams that had never been tested. The foreman asked what she wanted done. Clara told him to hold everything until the original inspector could be reached. By noon the story had reached the plant floor. Workers who had nodded at her in the parking lot now stopped to ask if the rumors were true. She answered each one the same way: the records would be corrected by the end of the week. Lydia Crane arrived in a company car just after 2, clipboard in hand, already promising the supplier a rush replacement certificate. Clara met her at the gate. She handed Lydia a single sheet, the unaltered test report from the Dayton lab, and waited while Lydia read it. The younger woman's face tightened, but she signed the hold order without argument. That left 38 hours until the supplier contract renewal meeting. Clara spent the evening at the diner again, the letter back in the briefcase on the seat beside her. Elias poured her coffee without asking and set the cup down with the handle turned her way. She told him the Dayton crates would clear once the real signatures were attached. He asked if she still had the old Union ledger from the 90s, the one with the handwritten calibration notes. She nodded. Neither of them mentioned what would happen if the next shipment arrived before the corrections were filed. The following morning the quality control phone rang again. This time the call came from the loading dock itself. A second supplier had shown up with paperwork that matched the falsified audits. The driver refused to unload until someone in authority explained why the dates had changed overnight. Clara walked down the stairs instead of taking the elevator. The letter stayed in the briefcase, but she carried a single folded page from the original ledger. When she reached the dock the driver was already talking to Lydia, voices raised over the idling diesel. Clara waited until the engine cut off, then opened the ledger page and laid it on the clipboard. The driver read the entry, checked the serial number against his own records, and signed the receiving slip without another word. Lydia watched the whole exchange but said nothing until the truck pulled away. Then she asked Clara what it would take for the 2 of them to finish the week without any more surprises. Clara answered that the surprise had already happened the day the dates were changed. She turned and walked back inside, the sound of the dock door rolling shut behind her. Now, you had to wonder how long Lydia thought she could keep the dates sliding like that. 38 hours left on the clock, and the supplier renewal sitting right there like a loaded spring. Clara didn't rush anything. She went back to the diner that night, same booth, the letter still tucked in the briefcase beside her. Elias brought over the coffee again, Handel turned her way, and asked if she'd pulled the calibration notes from the 90s ledger yet. She said she had. He didn't press further, just nodded and wiped the counter. Day 1 of the new audit cycle started with another phone call, this one straight to the receiving office. A third shipment had arrived with paperwork that copied the altered dates from the day before. The receiving clerk flagged it, but the driver wouldn't leave without a signature confirming the load matched the records on file. Clara took the stairs again. She carried one more folded page from the ledger, the one showing the original serial blocks from when the supplier first signed on back in '97. The letter stayed put in the briefcase. When she reached the dock, the driver was already pacing. Lydia stood there with her clipboard, trying to smooth things over with a promise that the dates would be corrected by morning. The driver wasn't buying it. He pointed at the mismatch and said the company could take the crates or explain it to the state inspector when they showed up next week. Clara waited for the voices to settle, then laid the ledger page on the clipboard next to the fresh paperwork. The driver read the old entry, matched the block numbers to his manifest, and signed off without another word. Lydia watched the truck pull away, then turned to Clara and asked if this was going to happen every time a new load came in. Clara told her the ledger had always been the real reference. She didn't add anything else. Just turned and headed back upstairs, the sound of her shoes on the concrete steps carrying through the empty stairwell. That left 26 hours. The next mini-crisis hit at the quality lab itself. An inspector from the parent company arrived unannounced, asking to see the calibration logs for the last 3 shipments. Lydia met him at the door, all smiles, and pulled up the digital files on the screen. They lined up with the altered dates she had approved. The inspector frowned and asked for the source documents. Lydia said they were in the system. He shook his head and said he needed the originals or the renewal meeting was going to open with a hold flag on the entire contract. Clara was already in the lab doorway by then, briefcase in one hand. She didn't speak right away. She just set the case on the bench, opened it, and slid the letter out far enough to reach the union ledger pages she had tucked underneath. The inspector noticed the movement but said nothing. Lydia stayed quiet too. Clara handed over the top sheet from the ledger, the one with the handwritten verification marks from the original audit chain. The inspector read it once, checked the dates against the digital log, and looked up at Lydia without a word. Then he signed the release form and said the meeting would proceed on schedule provided no further discrepancies turned up. Lydia waited until the inspector left the room before she asked Clara how many more of those pages she was carrying. Clara answered that it depended on how many shipments still needed the real signatures attached. She slipped the ledger page back into the briefcase, next to the letter, and walked out. The lab door clicked shut behind her. 19 hours remained. 19 hours remained, and you could feel the building settling into that quiet stretch before the real pressure hit. Clara walked the floor twice that afternoon, the way she always had, checking the seals on the crates that were already stacked for the morning load. The letter stayed in her briefcase, but every so often she'd rest her hand on the handle like she was making sure it hadn't gone anywhere. The next hitch showed up right after the second shift clocked out. A driver from the southern depot called in saying the latest pallet tags didn't match the bill of lading. Lydia took the call in the main office, voice steady, telling him the system numbers were the ones that counted. The driver pushed back. He said the physical count was short by 14 crates and the paperwork looked like it had been copied from an earlier run. Lydia hung up and turned to Clara, asking what she intended to do about it. Clara didn't answer at first. She set the briefcase on the desk, flipped it open just enough to slide out the original doc log from under the letter. The pages were creased but still legible, the entry numbers written in the same hand that had tracked every shipment for the last 38 years. She laid the log beside the digital printout. Lydia studied it, then asked where Clara had kept those pages all this time. Clara said they'd been in the same drawer since the contract started. She didn't add anything about who had filled them out or how many nights she'd stayed late to make sure the counts matched the actual freight. Lydia initialed the correction sheet and handed it back. The driver was told to accept the adjusted manifest and proceed. Lydia waited until the line went quiet before she said she expected Clara to keep those originals out of sight once the renewal meeting began. Clara nodded, slipped the log back under the letter, and clicked the case shut. By the time the night crew came on, the temperature in the loading bay had dropped enough that the concrete felt cold through the soles of your shoes. Clara stayed downstairs longer than usual, walking the rows of tagged pallets, the faint smell of treated wood and machine oil still hanging in the air. She paused at one stack, ran her thumb along the edge of a tag that had started to peel, and thought about how many times she'd replaced those same tags by hand before the computers took over. Nobody was watching, so she didn't rush. Another call came through just after midnight. This one from the parent company's regional rep, wanting confirmation that the calibration records for the last batch were already uploaded. Lydia was still at her desk, the light from the monitor reflecting off the framed safety certificate on the wall behind her. She pulled up the files, assured him everything was in order, and promised the originals would be available at the meeting. The rep asked if the union steward would be present. Lydia said the steward had retired 6 months earlier. She didn't mention that the steward's signature was still the one on the bottom of the real calibration sheet sitting in Clara's briefcase. Clara was in the hallway when the call ended. She heard the tail end of it through the open door and kept walking toward the stairs. The briefcase swung lightly at her side, the letter inside shifting against the ledger pages. She didn't stop to explain anything. She just kept her pace even, the sound of her steps the only thing echoing back up the stairwell. 10 hours remained when the maintenance supervisor came by with a question about the compressor settings on the oldest line. Lydia told him the automated logs were sufficient. The supervisor hesitated, then said the readings had been drifting for weeks and the only way to catch it was the handwritten notes from the original install crew. Lydia asked if those notes were still around. The supervisor glanced toward the back hallway, where Clara stood with the briefcase now resting on a low shelf. She didn't move forward. She only waited until the supervisor turned back to Lydia and said he'd check the archive again in the morning. Lydia nodded and went upstairs. Clara stayed where she was, the letter and ledger still tucked inside the case, the building settling around them one more time. 9 hours remained when the compressor on line 3 started that low rattle again, the kind you felt more in your boots than heard. Lydia was still upstairs when the night shift floor lead phoned her direct. He wanted to know if the drift logs from the last overhaul were in the system or if he needed to shut down early. Lydia told him the automated readings would cover it and to run the batch anyway. Then she hung up without checking the handwritten sheets still sitting in Clara's briefcase down in the archive hall. Clara heard the lead's voice through the stairwell door. She didn't answer it. She just stood where she was, thumb tracing the edge of that same peeling tag on the old compressor housing, the one she'd replaced by hand more times than she could count back when the union steward still kept the logbook open on the bench. The tag had started to curl again at the corners, like it always did when the humidity climbed. Nobody else ever noticed until the numbers went bad. The floor lead tried the regional rep next. That call came through while Lydia was locking her drawer. The rep asked the same question about the calibration originals. Lydia said they were on file and the meeting would clear everything up. She never mentioned the steward's name still inked on the bottom of the real sheets. When the line went quiet, Lydia walked past the hallway without looking in. Clara stayed put. The briefcase rested on the low shelf exactly where she'd left it, the letter inside pressed flat against the ledger pages again. 8 hours remained when the maintenance supervisor returned, flashlight in hand. He said the handwritten notes from the original install crew weren't in the archive after all. Lydia shrugged and told him to rely on the current logs. The supervisor hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, then glanced toward Clara. She didn't step forward. She simply waited until he turned back to Lydia and said he'd try the back file cabinet one more time before morning. Clara waited until both of them were gone. Then she pulled the old notebook from beneath the shelf, the one the steward had handed her the week before he retired. The pages smelled of machine oil and the faint trace of the coffee he used to keep on the bench. She copied the exact compressor settings onto a fresh sheet, folded it once, and slid it into the supervisor's locker without a word. The peeling tag on the housing caught the edge of her sleeve as she passed. She pressed it flat again, the same way she had years ago when the computers first arrived and nobody thought the tags would matter anymore. 7 hours remained when the regional rep called back. This time the question was about the parent company audit scheduled for the end of the week. Lydia assured him the records were complete. Clara stood at the far end of the hallway, briefcase now resting against her leg, and listened to the quiet settling of the building the way it used to do after every shift when the steward still walked the floor with her. The letter inside shifted once more against the ledger. She didn't open it. She just kept her hand on the worn handle and waited for the next call to come through. 6 hours remained when the first compressor started surging on the overnight shift. You could hear it down the hallway, that low whine climbing into something sharper, like the whole system was catching its breath wrong. Lydia was in the office reviewing the audit checklist when the alarm lights started blinking on the panel. She glanced up, frowned, and turned the volume down on the speaker without calling anyone. Clara stayed by the doorway, the briefcase handle warm under her palm. The letter inside had shifted again, the corner of the envelope now pressed against the edge of the ledger like it wanted out. She didn't move. She just watched the maintenance man, the same one who'd gone looking for the old notes earlier, hurry past with a radio in his hand. He stopped at the housing and stared at the peeling tag, then at the handwritten numbers someone had taped over it years ago. The numbers were starting to yellow at the corners. The man keyed his radio. "Lydia, the surge is getting worse. I don't see anything in the current logs that matches these readings." Lydia's voice came back thin through the speaker. "Use the settings we have. The system's rated for it." He hesitated, then looked toward the hallway where Clara stood. She met his eyes for a second, nothing more, and the man turned away. He walked to the locker, opened it, and found the fresh sheet she'd left there. His shoulders dropped a little as he read the copied settings. He adjusted the dials by hand, slow and careful, the way the old steward used to do before the computers took over. The whine dropped back to a steady hum. The alarm light steadied. 5 hours remained when the regional rep called again. This time the question was about a pressure reading from the main line that didn't match the parent company's new software. Lydia told him the discrepancy was probably a rounding error and promised to have the digital records updated by morning. She hung up and went back to her checklist without looking at the floor. Clara waited until the building quieted again. She walked the long way around the compressor housing, the same route the steward had shown her after his second heart attack when he could no longer climb the ladder himself. The tag on the housing brushed her sleeve once more. This time she left it alone. The letter inside the briefcase had stayed quiet through the surge, but she felt its weight shift when she stopped to listen to the system breathing again. 4 hours remained when the night shift operator came back from break and found the printed log from the surge sitting on the control desk. He picked it up, read the handwritten numbers, and looked around the empty room. "Who left this?" he asked no one. No one answered. He filed it anyway, sliding it under the current binder the way the rules said to do. Then he glanced toward the hallway where Clara still waited, briefcase against her leg, and gave the smallest nod before turning back to the panel. The system held through the rest of the night, running on the numbers the steward had taught her and the sheet she had copied without a name attached. The letter stayed inside the briefcase. The tag stayed on the housing. And the quiet rhythm of the compressors settled into something that sounded almost like it used to, back when the steward still walked the floor and the record still matched what the machines actually needed. 3 hours remained when the pressure on the east manifold began to climb. Not fast, not the kind of spike that trips an alarm right away, but steady enough that anyone who had walked these floors for 40 years would know it meant trouble by dawn. Clara stayed where she was, briefcase against her shin, and watched the needle on the old analog gauge the new software had never gotten around to replacing. Lydia had gone home. The regional rep was probably asleep. Only the night operator, Tom, the one who had given her that small nod, was left at the panel, and even he was starting to look uneasy at the numbers scrolling past. Tom turned the sheet of handwritten logs over twice before he spoke. "These don't line up with what the screen says. Not even close." He didn't look at Clara when he said it. He just kept his voice low, the way a man does when he's talking to himself but hoping someone will answer anyway. "You ever see the steward write numbers like this?" Clara didn't move. The tag on the compressor housing had brushed her sleeve again, its metal edge cool through her sleeve. She could feel the letter shift inside the briefcase, the same way it had shifted when the surge passed through. She had carried that letter for 6 years now, ever since the steward's second heart attack, and she still hadn't opened it in front of anyone. It wasn't sealed. It simply felt like the kind of thing that stayed private until the moment it didn't. Tom cleared his throat. "I asked if you'd seen numbers like this before." "Once or twice," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she meant. "Back when the steward still trusted the gauges more than the printouts." Tom didn't press. He just reached for the dial the old way the steward had shown her when the computers first came in and the readings started lying. 1/4 turn. Then another. The manifold pressure eased by 2 pounds. Not enough to fix anything for good, but enough to buy the night. Tom slid the printed log back under the binder, the same spot the rules said to keep it, and gave the smallest shake of his head at the screen. 2 hours remained when the phone rang again. This time it wasn't the regional rep, it was the day foreman, calling from home because the software alert had reached his tablet. He wanted to know why the pressure reading had been reported as stable when the overnight numbers told a different story. Lydia wasn't there to answer, so Tom did his best. He said something about a rounding error, the same line Lydia had used earlier, but the lie sat heavy in his mouth. When he hung up he looked toward the hallway again. Clara felt the weight of the briefcase pull at her shoulder. She thought about the steward's hands, the way they had shook near the end, and how he had still insisted on walking the floor one last time even though the ladder was already too much for him. She thought about the tag brushing her sleeve now, the same tag he had pointed to when he first showed her the manual override nobody in the parent company knew existed. 1 hour remained when the east manifold pressure crept up again. Tom tried the dial once more, but the old method only bought minutes this time. The new software kept feeding the compressors the wrong set points, the ones Lydia had copied from the manual that had never been updated after the last overhaul. Clara stayed quiet. She had promised herself she would not step in unless the system itself asked her to, and the system was asking now. The compressor's hum shifted from steady to something tighter, almost strained. Tom looked at the empty desk where the logs sat, then at the hallway. "If the steward were here," he said, not quite a question, "he'd know what to write on that sheet so it matched what the machines actually needed." Clara didn't answer out loud. She simply adjusted the tag on the housing so it hung straight again, the way the steward had always left it. The letter inside the briefcase settled against her leg when she straightened up. Outside, the sky was starting to lighten, and the day shift would be here soon. The compressors kept running, but the hum had changed pitch again, the way it always did when the numbers stopped belonging to the people who actually kept the place alive. That first morning after the steward passed, you could feel the difference in every corner of the control room. The day shift filed in at 7 sharp, coffee thermos in one hand and hard hat in the other, and nobody mentioned the overnight logs. But the compressors told their own story. The hum had settled into a thin, uneven whine by then, the kind that makes the floorboards under your boots feel just a shade off. Tom kept his eyes on the gauges while Clara stayed near the wall, briefcase still slung at her side. The tag on the housing caught the morning light, that same worn piece of metal the steward had touched every shift for 38 years. She straightened it again without thinking, the letter inside the case pressing against her ribs like a reminder she had not asked for. By mid-morning the east manifold pressure climbed again. Not a dramatic jump, just a slow creep that the new software refused to acknowledge. Tom twisted the dial the way Lydia had shown him on the tablet, but the reading on the screen stayed fixed while the needle on the old gauge kept moving. Two operators paused at the doorway, their voices low. 17 hours until the quarterly review, one of them said. If the numbers don't settle, we'll all be answering questions we don't have the answers to. Clara heard it. She felt the weight of the tag again, the way its edge had worn smooth under the steward's thumb. She thought about the letter inside the briefcase, the one he had sealed 2 days before the final shift, addressed in his careful block letters to whoever still knows the override sequence. No one else in the room had ever seen it. The pressure crossed the first warning line at 10:40. Tom reached for the phone, then put it down. Lydia's number sat on the list, but he knew the answer she would give, run the software as written. Clara watched the needle another long minute. Then she stepped forward, tapped the housing twice with the flat of her palm the way the steward had shown her years ago, and the whine dropped half a tone. The needle eased back just enough to clear the line. Tom looked at her. "You learned that from the old manuals too?" She didn't answer. She simply adjusted the tag one more time so it hung straight, then moved back to the corner. The operators at the doorway had already turned away. Only Tom kept watching, the question still sitting behind his eyes. By noon the sky had gone flat and gray. The day crew ran their checks, signed their sheets, and left the room quieter than it should have been. Clara stayed through lunch, the briefcase never leaving her shoulder. Every so often she touched the tag, not for luck but for the memory of the steward's voice telling her the parent company had never updated the software after the 1997 overhaul. 17 hours to the review, and the lie Lydia had built was already showing its first real crack. The compressors kept running. The hum stayed wrong. And the letter inside the case waited, unopened, the same way it had waited every day since the steward walked his last round. 17 hours can stretch long when the machines keep reminding you what they were built to do. By 2 that afternoon the light through the high windows had thinned to a dull smear across the gauge panels, and the second compressor started its own independent rattle, the kind that travels up through the floor and sits in your boots. Clara stayed where she was, the briefcase strap cutting across one shoulder, the tag cool against her palm. Tom had gone back to his desk but kept glancing over, the way a man does when he's trying to decide whether he imagined the earlier fix or whether it really happened. The rattle climbed. One of the newer operators leaned in from the corridor and called out that the temperature on line 3 was climbing past the mark it should have held all day. Lydia's morning memo had said the automated logs would catch any drift, they hadn't. The operator waited for an answer that didn't come. Tom picked up the phone again, set it down again, then looked straight at Clara. "You been through this before?" She didn't move at first. Then she walked to the panel, pressed 2 fingers against the housing exactly where the steward used to rest his own hand after every shift change, and waited. The rattle eased by half a notch, enough that the temperature needle crept back from the red. No one else in the room had known to try it. Clara let her hand drop and stepped away again, the tag swinging once before it settled. "Old trick," she said, quiet enough that only Tom heard. From before the software took over the timing. He nodded slow, the kind of nod that meant he'd file the moment away rather than press it right then. The operators in the doorway drifted off to other tasks. The compressors settled into something closer to their old rhythm, but the underlying whine never left entirely. By 4 o'clock the shift log showed 3 separate warnings that the quarterly numbers would not clear without manual overrides. The company had stopped training anyone to perform after 1997. Clara watched the clock on the wall. 16 hours now. She touched the edge of the tag again, feeling the letter shift slightly inside the briefcase lining when she moved. The steward had sealed it the night before his last walkthrough, the address written in the same careful capitals he used on every maintenance tag. No one had opened it because no one else knew the sequence it referenced. She had carried it every shift since, the same way he had carried the tag itself through 40 years of rounds. At 6 the day crew left and the evening skeleton staff came in, 2 men who checked their watches and said little. The sky outside stayed flat. Clara made coffee in the small pot by the door, the smell of it mixing with the warm metal and faint oil that never left the control room. She carried her cup back to the corner and stood listening while Tom ran the evening checks. Every line he read from the printed sheet matched the memo Lydia had sent that morning. None of them matched what the gauges were actually showing. Around 8 the third pressure warning lit, this one on the backup feed the software was supposed to have isolated. Tom called Lydia's office line and got the message service. He hung up, looked at the board, then looked at Clara again. "If you know something else that isn't in the book," he said, "now would be the time." She crossed to the panel, tapped the same housing twice, then reached behind it and turned a small manual valve the steward had installed in 1994 and that had never been removed because no one after him had known it existed. The feed stabilized. The warning light went dark. Tom wrote the reading in the log without comment. The 2 evening men stayed at their stations, faces turned toward their own screens. Clara returned to the corner. The tag rested against her shirt, the worn edge catching a little light when she breathed. 15 hours to the review. The letter waited. The compressors kept their uneasy hum. And the room stayed quiet enough that every small sound, the click of a pen, the scrape of a chair, carried further than it should have. Tom kept his eyes on the board, but the question that had started behind them in the morning had grown larger by the hour. Tom looked over once more, that question sitting heavier now. "Clara," he said, quiet enough the evening men wouldn't catch it, "you used to come in with him on the late shifts, didn't you? Back when the place still ran on paper logs and a man's word." She didn't answer right away. Just lifted the cup, took a slow sip, and set it down where the ring it left could fade on its own. The tag shifted against her blouse when she moved, the stamped numbers catching the low light from the board. 40 years her husband had worn it on the same chain, and she'd kept it the day they handed her the last box from his locker. The compressors settled into a lower note, then climbed again without warning. A 4th gauge flickered, feed pressure on line 3, the one the software had flagged as redundant and therefore ignored. Tom reached for the phone, stopped halfway, and looked at her instead. She stepped forward, same as before, and this time she didn't wait for him to ask. Her hand found the side panel on the old manifold, the one the drawings no longer showed. 2 fingers pressed the release, and the cover swung open on hinges that still moved smooth because someone had greased them every winter without writing it down. Inside, a bypass lever sat exactly where it had since the original install. She eased it half an inch, waited for the needle to climb back into the green, then closed the panel again. The room stayed quiet except for the steady tick of the clock on the wall. Tom wrote the new reading in the log. One of the evening men glanced over, said nothing, and turned back to his screen. The tag rested against Clara's chest, worn now from the hours she'd stood there. She thought of the letter in her pocket, the one Lydia's assistant had left at the front gate that morning, folded twice and sealed with the company stamp. It said the review board would meet at 8 sharp. It didn't say who would be allowed to speak. By midnight the first evening man had gone for coffee and come back with 2 cups, one of which he set near Clara without a word. The second warning of the night came at 12:40, a temperature spike on the return line that should have triggered an automatic shutoff. It didn't. Tom swore under his breath and reached for the manual override, but the override light stayed dark. Clara moved to the far end of the panel, opened the small access door that had been painted over twice and never stripped, and turned the small brass knob inside exactly 3/4 of a rotation. The spike dropped. The system steadied. Tom watched her hands. "He showed you that one too," he said. "Not a question this time." She nodded once. "He showed me all of them. Said someone ought to remember when the new people stopped asking." 10 hours to the review. The letter stayed in her pocket, the edge of the envelope worn smooth from her thumb. The tag caught the light again when she breathed out. Outside the flat sky had gone fully dark, and the only sound left in the room was the low, uneasy hum of machines that still worked because someone who no longer had a badge remembered how to keep them that way. Tom stayed at his station, the question in his eyes grown quiet but no smaller. 9 hours to the review, and the room felt tighter with every tick of that wall clock. Tom kept glancing at the tag on Clara's chest, the way it caught the low light whenever she leaned forward to check a gauge. You have to picture it, the old brass oval, initials worn almost smooth from years against denim work shirts, the same one her father wore through every shift until the day they boxed his tools and sent them home. Clara didn't touch it. She just let it rest there while she watched the pressure lines crawl. The new crisis started quiet, the way the others had. A compressor on the south line began to labor, its rhythm off by a single beat, then two. Tom's screen lit up with a yellow warning that should have rolled into red within minutes. It didn't. The reading just hovered there, pretending everything was fine while the metal underneath started to heat past spec. Tom reached for the phone to call maintenance, then stopped. "They'll say the override's already logged," he muttered. "Won't come till morning." Clara moved without hurry. She crossed to the side panel that carried the faint smell of old paint and solvent, the one the evening crew never opened because the handle stuck and the new manual said it was decommissioned. She slipped the tag inside her collar for safety, then worked the stubborn latch with the flat of her palm. Inside sat a hand her father had installed himself, back when the plant still ran on 3 men per shift and a rotary phone on the desk. She gave it a quarter turn, listened for the click that meant the bypass had seated, then eased it back. The compressor settled. The yellow light blinked once and went steady green again. Tom watched the whole thing. "That wasn't in any manual I ever saw," he said. Not accusing, just stating it like a man counting up small facts that no longer added up. Clara closed the panel. He kept the real diagrams in a drawer under the main console. Said the company liked clean copies better than the ones with grease on them. She didn't add the rest, that her father had drawn those lines himself on nights when the shift ran long and the only light came from the work lamp overhead. The letter in her pocket felt heavier now, its edge pressed against her hip. 8.5 hours left. The third man on the shift came back from his rounds and set a thermos on the table without comment. Coffee, still warm. Clara poured a cup but didn't drink. She kept her hand on the logbook instead, writing the new reading in her father's old neat block letters. Tom noticed that too. He didn't ask the question out loud, but the room held it anyway. Outside, the flat dark stayed flat. Inside, the machines kept their low hum because a woman with no badge and a father's tag had remembered which wheels still answered to a careful hand. The review board would meet at 8, and the letter didn't say whether Clara would be asked a single thing. Tom stayed at his station, eyes on the monitors, the quiet between them growing thicker with every passing minute that proved the place still worked only because someone who no longer belonged there had never truly left. 7 hours now. The shift log sat open under the work lamp, Clara's block letters filling the next line just as the old diagrams had taught her. Tom kept glancing sideways, not at the monitors anymore but at the way her hand moved without hesitation, like muscle memory from somewhere the company records never wrote down. Then the low hum changed. Not the compressor this time, the feed line on the south header. A faint rattle started, the kind that used to wake her father from the cot in the back room. Clara set the cup down untouched. She walked the length of the console, listening, and stopped at the pressure gauge that had never quite matched the drawings on the wall. The needle quivered at the edge of the red. Tom stood. That line's supposed to be isolated. We shut it down last week per the memo. Memo says isolated, Clara answered, already reaching for the auxiliary valve. Didn't say anything about the bypass they ran under the floor in '78. She knelt, found the access plate her father had cut himself so one man could reach it without shutting the whole header. The tag at her collar shifted against her skin, cool metal reminding her which way the wheel turned when the pressure had to move slow. She gave it 3 careful clicks. The rattle eased. The needle dropped back to the middle of the safe range and stayed there. Tom watched the whole thing, arms folded now. Your father show you that too? Clara wiped her hands on a rag from the drawer. Showed me the plate. Said it kept the line from hammering when the main pump cycled. Company never put it on the prints because it wasn't on the original order. The third man came back in, saw the gauge steady, and poured himself coffee without a word. The letter in her pocket pressed harder against her hip with every minute that passed. Outside the windows the dark had turned from flat to the first gray before dawn. Inside, the machines held because the hands that knew the hidden valve still moved when they had to. 5.5 hours. Tom sat again, eyes on the monitors but mind clearly elsewhere. He didn't ask the question, but the air carried it anyway. How does a woman with no badge know the exact quarter turn that quiets a line the memo said shouldn't even be running? Clara stayed at the console, one palm resting on the logbook, the other brushing the tag just once to make sure it stayed hidden. The review board would sit at 8 sharp. The letter still didn't say whether she'd be allowed in the room. All it had said was that the plant's records would be examined and any person without current credentials would be asked to wait outside. The south header stayed quiet. The compressor stayed green. The low hum of the whole place kept its steady rhythm because the knowledge that had kept it running for 30 years still answered when the new procedures left something out. Tom reached for the thermos and poured her a fresh cup without asking. He set it beside the logbook and didn't look at her when he spoke. Board's gonna want to know how you got in here tonight. Clara didn't answer right away. She watched the gauge hold steady another minute, then turned the page in the log and wrote the next reading in the same neat block letters her father had used when the rotary phone still sat on the desk. Outside, the gray deepened toward morning light. Inside, the machines kept their low steady sound, and the tag stayed tucked where only she could feel it. The board met in the old conference room off the main floor, the one with the long oak table that still smelled of cigarette ash from the days when the rotary phone had a cord. 8 men and 2 women sat with folders open. Clara walked in at 5 minutes to 8, the letter in her pocket now creased from her thumb worrying the edge. Tom followed 2 steps behind. He carried the logbook but kept his eyes on the floor until the chairman, a man named Reed who'd arrived 6 months earlier from corporate, cleared his throat. Reed started with the memo that said Clara had no credentials. Then he asked how she'd entered the pump house after midnight. Clara laid the tag on the table. It was her father's, the one with the stamped number from the original crew that had built the south header in 1973. The room went quiet while Reed turned it over twice. She answered every question the same way she'd answered the gauges, with the next exact reading. The quarter turn on the auxiliary valve no print ever showed. The bypass line the company had called scrap. The pressure drop that only happened when the main pump cycled past the worn seal they'd never budgeted to replace. One of the younger engineers opened his laptop and pulled up the overnight data. The numbers matched what Clara had written in the log. Reed looked at Tom and asked why the night shift hadn't caught it first. Tom set the logbook down and said the procedures the new training manual gave them left the header line out entirely. He'd followed the manual. Clara hadn't. Then he looked at her and added that he'd told her to stay outside the fence. The chairman asked for the plant status. Every gauge now sat in the green. The compressor that had been one bad reading from shutdown held steady. Reed closed his folder. He turned to Tom and asked if the woman without credentials had kept the line running when the manual said it shouldn't even exist. Tom nodded once. Reed stood. He walked around the table and stopped in front of Clara. "We asked you to wait outside," he said. "You didn't. You fixed what we didn't know was broken." He offered his hand. She took it. The tag stayed on the table between them. After the board adjourned, Tom waited by the door until the others left. He asked if she wanted the tag back. Clara said it had done its job. He asked why she'd come at all when the letter only gave her the right to sit in the hall. She told him the plant had been her father's last job and her first. 30 years later the same valve still needed the same quarter turn. Tom waited another moment. Then he said he should have asked her sooner. He apologized for the memo that carried his name. He said he'd sign whatever it took to put her back on the floor with a current badge. Clara told him she'd think about it. She picked up the tag, slipped it into her pocket again, and walked out into the morning light that had finally reached the windows. 2 weeks later the company held a short ceremony in the same room. They presented her with a framed copy of the original plant drawings, the ones her father had marked by hand before the machines ever ran. Reed read a statement that the south header and 3 other lines now carried the name of the woman who had kept them working when the prints ran out. Tom stood at the back and added that the plant ran because experience still answered when the procedures stopped. Clara listened, then shook the hands that were offered. She went home that afternoon to the house with the mortgage paid off 30 years ago. The old rotary phone still sat on the kitchen counter, though it only rang when her daughter called from 2 states away. She set the tag beside it. The metal had warmed in her pocket and now rested cool against the formica. The letter from the board lay open beside it, the one that offered her the title of shift supervisor if she wanted it. She poured coffee into the same thermos Tom had used that night and watched the light move across the table. The plant kept its low steady sound 6 blocks away, the way it always had, because the hands that knew the hidden valve still moved when they had to. Some things never needed new prints. They only needed someone willing to remember where the valves actually were.